All right. Hey, everyone. We are back with a special session from Aisha K. Staggers. So, Aisha is a writer, literary agent, and currently the managing editor for Sister to Sister magazine and News Onyx. Her presentation is 7 Ways Prince Celebrates Black History, Culture, and Political Ideology in the Rainbow Children. I'll turn it over to Aisha.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My father does not listen to Prince. My father is old school 1970s soul music and rhythm and blues, funk. That's what my dad's into, but mostly 1970s soul. And so he's listening to the title track, and that's my music. That's my era. That sounds like Gil Scott-Heron and the Last Poets and the messages. And he starts to listen to the whole album, and he's like, yeah, the messages. And we get into this deep discussion of how unapologetically Black this particular album is, and the messages that Prince incorporated into this particular album. And so at that point, I started listening to all of Prince's music through this particular lens, because just as my own experiences as a Black person in this country shapes me as a writer and shapes my writing, I realized, and I don't know why I realized this so late, but again, I was in my mid-20s, his experience as a Black man in America shapes his writing as a musician. Looking at his album now, I can see that back then he kind of started to incorporate that particular aspect of himself in his albums until his very last. And I began making connections within the Rainbow Children to history and to creative Black culture, talking about meaning the arts and literature, and into political ideology. Most ideology, there is theological ideology in it, but mostly for me it was political, because Black people, the personal is political. And looking at his background and putting it all together and finding out how he really connected generations of Blackness in this one particular album. And so I found so many examples, and there's so many more to explore in this album that I'm still going through it, trying to make connections and find examples. But this presentation, I picked out 7 that I wanted to explore with you and kind of make the connections with you, because I've learned from fans and just reading fan comments, reading fan opinions, that with the fan community, either you love the Rainbow Children or you're about it. And when I read those comments from a lot of people, I think it is how people listen to it and not being able to make those connections. And I think when you start to see some of those connections and those historical connections, that you might listen to it differently. So here are my 7 ways Prince celebrates Black history, culture, and political ideology. The first one is the cover art by Cbabi Bayoc. And I have a link here to his website and the cover art that he did. The images in the Rainbow Children, the cover art, and when you go inside the liner notes and you see just the artwork, these elongated images and the drawings of the band, and just, it's Black art at its finest. But for me, it also reminded me of another Black artist, and that was Ernie Barnes. If you know 70s Black TV, then you know the show Good Times. And Good Times had a character named JJ who was an artist. And in every episode, they featured his artwork, which was actually the work of artist Ernie Barnes. And I also have a link here for Ernie Barnes's work. And Ernie Barnes did the artwork for the cover of another album that at the time Rainbow Children was released, was celebrating its 25th anniversary. And that was Marvin Gaye's I Want You album. And Ernie Barnes' artwork is very similar to the artwork you see on the cover of The Rainbow Children, very elongated images of Black folks living Black life. And so that was one of the first connections that I made. And I learned this later on, that from an interview I did with Andre Simone, that Good Times was actually one of Prince's favorite TV shows back in the 60s. And it was like he never missed an episode, that and What's Happening. So it was another kind of celebration of this culture of Black TV and Black art that I found in that, but also Black music with the kind of shout out to Marvin Gaye. The second example is this concept of three. 1+1+1 is 3, which is, obviously the theme of this conference. But in the song, 1+1+1 is 3 takes on many meanings. It can mean, obviously, the Holy Trinity, God the Son, the Holy Spirit. In the song, it can mean you, me, and God is a divine relationship. But if you take the civil rights era and civil rights ideology and take what's politically expedient for Black people in order to be free in this country, the premise of the civil rights era, in order to achieve absolute freedom for Black people in this country, was built on 3 things. The first being political access, meaning the right to the ballot, the right to vote, economic success, which if you have economic freedom and generational wealth, then that gives you a certain kind of freedom as well. You're not dependent on social programs, and you're not dependent on having to find certain kinds of jobs. You can also add entrepreneurship in that. And then access to facilities, meaning public schools, public libraries, any kind of public building that had been segregated. 1+1+1 = free, as in freedom. And that's the divine relationship between Blacks and America. And that is supposed to be the ultimate promise of this country to its people, but it's not living up its end of that bargain to people of color. And also is something that I think throughout this album, Prince kind of reminds you that there is this lack of freedom for people of color. And it's something that hovers over just about every song. He wants to remind you that there is this inequality, even though the album is called The Rainbow Children, it is rooted in Blackness. And he wants you to understand that for a certain segment of the population, there is an inherent inequality that exists. And that there are these things that are in place that keep people from achieving complete and total freedom. The third example was a fun connection for me to make at the time, was this kind of nod to the neo-soul movement that was going on in early 2001, where in the song Mellow, he gives this shout out to Macy Gray and Common. Well, in 2001, I was sitting and listening to this song, and I'm saying to myself, oh my gosh, that he was talking about Macy Gray and Common. And where now people are probably familiar with which Common he's talking about. But how many people, if you ask yourself, did you know he was talking about Common, the rapper that only had one single, The Light, with Bilal? But it goes a little bit deeper than that. Neo-soul is a derivative of the soul music that he listened to as a child. Those artists that he mentioned in his memoir, The Emotions, in the Ohio Players, and other groups, he covered the stylistics. The neo-soul movement was about remaking that soul music for a new generation. And the fact that he was able to bridge this gap between the old and the new and bring it all together, I was just really amazed about. But then he continued to work with it, because that was also the same year that Alicia Keys recorded How Come You Don't Call Me Anymore. And then Prince does this duet with Angie Stone. And then, as you can see, he continued to work with neo-soul artists like Lettucey, and he continued to just stay in that moment. And if you want to be honest, people who say, oh, they don't play Prince on the radio anymore, actually, that is where he can be found in his music after that period. My mother listens to this neo soul station on Sirius XM, and every time I get in the car with her, they played Prince at least twice in a 1 hour period. And that's where he kind of landed as an artist on the radio. So I thought that was a very unique kind of connection for him to make with music and in bringing back that spirit. But also, too, the neo soul movement really came out of Black is Beautiful movement as well. Neo soul music was really about Black is beautiful and Black power, which is something, and the whole soul movement. In his memoir, there are pictures of Prince's Soul 71, Soul 72 buttons. Those buttons came out of the Black Power movement, as I was told by many people who had them at the time. My mother had the buttons, and this isn't really a celebration, but he does pay homage to slavery and the modern impact of slavery that we see in two songs, particularly Muse to the Pharaoh being the first one and Family Name being the second one. One of the comments that I see often from fans is this mention of the Holocaust in the lyrics of Muse to the Pharaoh. And what I realize is that a lot of people mistake what they call the Black Holocaust in the 1600s for the 1940s Holocaust of Jews in Europe. And when you read the next line, that is when it's clear which Holocaust he's talking about. Would you rather be dead or be sold? That line always moves me because I've read slave narratives. One of the things that I think Prince does with his music is that he makes you want to go and explore and research and look at other things that he may mention in passing and study them further. And I went and read some of these slave narratives that are archived and are in the Library of Congress and actually accessible online. And a lot of the slaves, particularly women, I find the question that they often ask themselves is, would they rather be dead or be sold? And depending on the plantation that they were on, no plantation was good. They all say that. But some of these phrases that we say nowadays that we don't think are rooted in the history of slavery are. You have things like being sold down the river. That is a saying that meant for people who are being sold to Mississippi, down the river to Mississippi. These narratives, women were talking about they would rather have been dead than to be sold. And the part in Family Name where he talks about this little scenario about what's your name? No, your name's Tom Lynch reminds me of the scene in Roots where Kunta Kinte is being beat to death, well, nearly beat to death to learn his new American name. These two instances where Prince addresses slavery, I think make people very uncomfortable because slavery makes people uncomfortable. The talk about slavery makes people uncomfortable. I don't think he does it the way that he did Dirty Mind in order to shock people's senses. I think this was a way to educate people. He does a lot with just a few words in both songs. And the connection here is that for a lot of people, it is the reckoning that, you know, this is part of his heritage. I think too often it's easy to, because he preached love for one another and loved everybody regardless, it's easy to say, well, that's not the kind of Black person he was. He wasn't into looking at that. But I don't think that you can be part of the Black culture without ever questioning what slavery has done to your community as a whole. And I think that when he got to really starting to question his own existence as a musician and his dispute with Warner Brothers, I think that he started to look more intricately at himself and his own existence. Because sometimes when you're being taken advantage of, one of the things that people of color do is say, am I being taken advantage of because I'm a person of color? What are the dynamics here? And are these at play? You can really see that kind of metamorphosis. And I can't remember exactly who it was that told me this. And I've been racking my brain for weeks, but I sit with someone who told me that as a Black person, you have to be careful in this industry because people will try and take advantage of you and will try and take ownership of the things that you have because they think that you're not smart and they think that you won't protect yourself. Example number 5, Prince as Black history. And seeing himself as a part of Black history with the 20th anniversary of controversy occurring at the same time that this is released, and pulling out parts of his own catalog and reusing his own lyrics. And this particular line from Sexuality, Reproduction of the New Breed, Leaders Stand Up, Organize. It has a dual meaning here is that, he also recognizes that he's of a generation that needs to kind of let go and encourage new people, younger people, and really try and change things. At that time, it would have been my generation. Unfortunately, my generation was kind of like, yeah, we're not doing it. Pass the baton on to the next one. You then see him yet again later, like in 2013, 2014, 2015, doing the same thing, which is one of the reasons why he was so impressed with Black Lives Matter, because these were young people taking the mantle and using new ideas and leading and organizing, raising money for their own causes. And he was one of the people who did donate to their cause. But I kind of laughed when I heard this in that song. And then as I was working on this presentation, because I recall being at a civil rights conference and how difficult it is for older generations to kind of want to pass on the baton and to have someone of Prince's generation so easily to want to. But he's that half generation up from civil rights leaders. And I recall being at a conference where Julian Bond, who was a member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee with John Lewis and working with Martin Luther King, said to us young people, you'll have to pry the baton out of my cold, dead hand. So it was nice to hear someone say, let's pass this on. I want to see younger people get involved. And also, too, I think this is yet another part where Prince does something that he didn't normally do. You know how he's always said that he didn't go back and listen to his old catalog. Here he is pulling from it, where he didn't reflect on the past. Well, with this album, he did a whole lot of reflecting on the past and history. And then he also put himself in history in this particular album. So he's celebrating history by also celebrating his place within it. And the 6th example I have is I hear the work as a type of freedom song. Now, let me tell you, there are 3 types of freedom songs, the way I see it. The first is Negro Spirit, which is very traditional, what we would call kind of gospel in nature, but it had its place, particularly on the plantation, where the slaves in the fields would sing these songs to help them get through the workday. But they also had these hidden messages in them that allowed for people to learn routes to escape, ways to keep themselves safe, and ways to communicate when they couldn't outwardly communicate. And then there are the 1960s freedom songs, which were sung by marchers to kind of keep up their stamina. Also, a kind of bit of a nod to James Brown here with this song in particular, because James Brown was good for having a part one and a part two of almost every song. And then you had the 1970s groups like the OJs with a number of socially conscious songs. Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes with songs like Wake Up Everybody and McFadden and Whitehead, Ain't No Stopping Us Now. The Temptations with songs like Ball of Confusion, and the Stylistics with People Make the World Go Round. And so they have these kind of freedom and message songs that were danceable and entertaining as much as they had this socially conscious message. And I think that with the work, he embodies all three of those types of freedom songs in one song. And it kind of demonstrates the scope and the history of this type of song in one song. And I think that he does a very, very good job of showcasing how music is used to motivate Black people into movement, into social movement, and is progressive in that way. And the last example comes from The Everlasting Now in its set of lyrics where he talks about, being the brother on stage and singing to an integrated audience and teaching the integrated audience to sing. And he makes reference to the song Everyday People, but he also talks about changing the funk and putting it in a new bag. And he's speaking specifically here about Sly Stone, men like Sly Stone, James Brown, and himself, and how being Black and being famous Black men in America, and that no matter how you change the music, how you change the social structure, how you change the fit of it all and what people like in the mainstream, when it comes down to it, and if you mess with the things that America holds sacred, and you are a Black person, America has a way of reminding you, no matter what, you might have had all the women, have had all the money, all the fame in the world, you're still a Black person in this country. And so those are my 7 examples of how he celebrates or basically looks at Black history, Black culture, and Black political ideology in the Rainbow Children. And I would encourage you all to, and like I said, I'm not even finished. There are still so many other ways to look at different lyrics and different sounds and different just aspects and performances of the Rainbow Children songs and videos, and really pick apart all the ways that he looks at Blackness inside. And I would encourage you to go back and kind of re-listen to the album and see if you can find ways yourself and make those connections, because the connections are transgenerational, and they're as much about the past as they are about the present.
So thank you again, Aisha, for such a phenomenal presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.